Are we already in February? Yes. Is it probably too late to do a favorite palettes of 2024? Maybe. Am I still gonna do it? Absolutely. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Noopur. I love indie makeup and all things color and sparkle. Today I'm going to be going over my top 10 palettes of 2024, and I actually meant to get this video up earlier in January, but life happened and I wasn't able to get to it till now, so I hope that people are still interested in watching. So for this video I'm going to be doing my top 10 palettes, and this is going to be excluding all collab palettes in the top 10, because I feel like with collab palettes I'm a bit, a lot of the times these palettes are in collaboration with some of my friends, and so I'm going to be a bit more biased than I am towards other palettes. But because I did really love a lot of the collab palettes that came out this year, I'm going to cheat a little bit and put 3 of my favorite collab palettes at the end of the video as kind of like honorable mentions. Something that I was thinking about as I was making my selections for this video was, favorites are so personal. It's such a subjective thing. And obviously I chose these with my own preferences and tastes in mind. And a common theme here is how much I love the color story. But because this is such a personal thing, maybe none of these palettes will be your favorite, but that does make me wonder, what are your favorites? Please comment down below. I'm so curious to know what your favorite palettes of 2024 were. Also, just a little disclaimer, these are in no particular order because you could not make me rank these if you paid me to. I am a true Libra and I would not be able to put a number to these palettes because my tastes change from day to day. Some days I want warm tones, some days I want cool tones, some days I want to layer my shimmers, and some days I want to go a bit more matte heavy, so I could not rank these in any definitive way. And then the last disclaimer is that I did receive a lot of these palettes in PR, and I also have codes with a lot of these brands, so I will note that on the screen as well as in the description box. Okay, now we can get into the palettes. So first up we have Titanium Fox's Puppy Quiet. This was one of the first palettes that I knew I would be purchasing in 2024. And the reason for that was the owner, Clara, usually before she even reveals the color story of her palettes, she'll start doing looks to start teasing the color story. And it's a bit of a guessing game. People like to guess what the final color story of the palette will be. And I had so much fun seeing people put together their guesses for this palette. And then when it was finally revealed, I fell for it. To me, this is a perfect spring palette because if you know me, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of pastels, and I feel like everyone loves to do pastels in spring. And for me, if I'm going to wear pastels, I want to pair them with other colors. But to me, this palette kind of feels like murky pastels almost. It has those slightly, it has that colorful feel that I associate with spring, but the colors are slightly muted. And because of that, it just makes it so much more wearable to me than traditional spring brights. The matte formula in here is very easy to work with, and I mean, all the palettes in my top 10 are going to be very easy to work with, otherwise they wouldn't be in my top 10. But the matte formula here is kind of on the thin side, but very buildable, blends out super easily, which is very evident in Clara's looks with this palette. Also, Clara, I'm not sure if you could go by Clara or Clara if you're watching this, I'm so sorry. But when you see her looks, she will sometimes do just 2 shadow looks where she will even take this palette doesn't have super dark tones, but in her other palettes there are much darker colors, and she'll blend that one color out with so much ease, and I feel like that's the mark of a true good matte. And then the shimmer selection in here is really good too. I love how they pair with the mattes in this palette. And then the other thing that you'll notice is that there's a column of iridescence over here, which I think adds so much to the palette. This one is kind of a standard, pink, orange, gold shifting iridescent, but these two are very special. This one is a gorgeous purple shade. It's got so much dimension to it, and I feel like I don't really have many iridescents like it, if anything exactly like it. And then this one over here is this gorgeous green shifting iridescent. It's actually what I have in my inner corner right now. You can see that vibrant green shift straight on, but then to the side, it shifts to blue and even indigo. It's super smooth and super sparkly, and I always reach into this palette specifically for this shade. Next up is Blend Bunny Longing, which this palette took my love affair with cool tones and desaturated tones to a whole new level. This palette follows the standard Blend Bunny layout where typically the columns go from light to deep and then there's a shimmer, which I am a fan of this layout because I think it makes for really foolproof blending because, you know, you have your light blending out shade, you have your transition crease shade, and then you have a deepening outer corner shade, which I really like for when I'm doing my more simple looks for day to day. It's like I can turn my brain off and just go down the column and have a good look. One thing I really love about the matte selection in this palette is that there are a bunch of deepening up options that aren't a straight black. There is one straight black in this palette. I think it's this shade over here. But then the rest of the deep tones are just super, super deep dark without being black, which I know that when this palette was launched, there was some criticism for the deep shades looking a little similar, but I think that the darker your skin is, the less similar they're going to look, the more the undertones are going to be pulled out, especially as you blend out the deep tones and as you blend them into lighter shades, which, let's be real, most of us are using deepening shades to do that. The other thing I want to note about this palette is I think this was the first palette where I noticed that Blend Bunny was really starting to level up their shimmers, because I think all the shimmers in this palette are a step above what they've had in the past, and not all of them are the same level of sparkle. For example, this shade and this shade over here are not as sparkly as the rest, but they still have more sparkle than some of the shades that I've seen from Blend Bunny in the past. And I think my only criticism with the shimmers is that this shade and this shade are a little similar because they're both kind of these baseless, wet-looking, silvery white, sparkly shimmers, but they're a little too similar to both being the same palette, in my opinion. Next, we have Belle Beaute Bar's Poison Garden, which when I saw this color story, I was so happy, so happy, because this is something that I've been wanting to see from the brand for quite some time now. This is a perfect, muted, grungy, almost rainbow palette, which I feel like we saw a lot of muted and desaturated tones from indies in 2024, and I'm so glad to see an option from Belle Beaute Bar. I think that the Poison Garden theme is so cool, and the individual shade names really reflect that, which I love. And then I also really like the matte selection in this palette because I feel like it's pretty balanced between colorful tones and neutrals. Like for the neutrals, you have this gray, you have the brown. I will say the one thing I don't like about this palette is the black sequin matte, because I don't like black mattes in my palettes and I don't like sequin mattes either. And so I could have... My dog just started barking in her sleep. But hang on. I was saying that I really like how the palette is balanced between colorful tones and neutral tones, and there are even shades that walk the line between that. Specifically this shade over here, which, you know, it has a lot of gray in it, but it's also a little teal, which is so interesting to me, and I feel like it's one of those shades that would be really easy for people who are scared of color to wear. And I think that kind of encapsulates this palette as a whole, because everything is slightly muted and desaturated. So I feel like it's a very approachable palette for those who maybe haven't played too much with color before. And I haven't even talked about the shimmer shades yet, which Belle Beaute Bar has a fantastic shimmer formula, and I think the shades in this palette, the shimmer shades, complement the mattes really well. There are a couple of hollow shades in the palette, and this shimmer and these two are standouts to me. The orange one is just super vibrant and fiery. We love to see it. The blue one is super glowy and not as sparkly, but it has that like vibrant electric blue that just dazzles. And then the black-based one has a ton of multicolored sparkles, which makes it so special. The next two are from Unearthly, and I want to talk about these two together because I was trying to choose, for the most part, just one palette per brand, but I could not make up my mind between these two, and I almost kind of see them as sister palettes. So the reason I think of these as sister palettes is because both of them have a bit of a spooky vibe to them. They both have a few desaturated muted colors. Are you sensing a theme in my favorites here? But Gargoyle tends to lean a bit more cool, while Just a Taste leans a bit more warm. I have only tried Unearthly from the Sorceress Smoke palette onwards, which I know that was around the time where they started revamping their shimmers. And in my opinion, Unearthly is one of those brands that does both a matte formula and a shimmer formula very, very well. Their matte formula is a bit on the sheer buildable side, a bit thin and not too much kick up in the pan. And the shimmers they're bonkers. They have so much dimension to them while still having a refined luxe finish. But at the same time, you get a variety of textures. Nothing is super flaky, but you have everything from like a more satin finish to a more smooth, shifty finish to an ultra sparkly, wet looking finish. And I just really love the variety of shimmers that you get in Unearthly palettes. Next up is Fantasy Cosmetica's Harvest of Souls palette, which I gasped when I opened up this palette. The color story is so beautiful, and it's the brand's first foray into a 16 pan palette format, and I think they did such a great job. This is yet another color story where you have a good mix of both bright and muted colorful tones, and I love the color story. I love the matte selection here. I love that there are some super light shades as well as really deep dark shades. This matte down here is such a deep dark green matte, and I love, love, love to see it. I feel like Fantasy Cosmetica is known for doing these super cohesive and well thought out color stories, which we've seen in the 9-pan format a lot of times. And so to see a larger color story that gives you a good variety but is also super cohesive is really nice to see. And going back to this deep dark green matte, I feel like it was the perfect choice to make the darkest matte because it goes with so many of the shades. So even though, I mean, this shade is pretty deep too, but this one is on a different level. And so I just feel like it's a smart color story. I also think it was a really smart move to do only 6 shimmers in the 16 pan palette because since it is a larger palette, it is going to by nature be more expensive, but keeping it to only 6 shimmers helps keep it from going into just, you know, bonkers expensive territory. That being said, I am not the biggest fan of these 2 hollows over here because I feel like the hollow is a little difficult to see compared to some other formulas that I've tried. And then on the flip side, this shimmer up here is so, so pretty. It is so unique in my collection, and I have a lot of shimmers, like a lot of shimmers between palettes and singles. It's ridiculous, and I just feel like it's such a special shade. It's beautiful. Lastly, I just want to mention that this entire palette is magnetic, just like their other palettes, both their 9-pan as well as their 12-pan. So it's really nice to see a Fantasy Cosmetica 16-pan palette to do really fun BYOPs with their other shades. Moving on to Dieverune Cosmetics Gloomy Gardens palette, which can we take a minute to admire this artwork because wow. I know it was designed by Millie, aka Bad to the Brow, and she did such a good job on it because I feel like not only is it super beautiful, but it also really encapsulates the color story. And boy, am I a sucker for a good color story. This is one of those color stories that when it was revealed, it made my heart flutter. I love it so much. The matte formula is a bit on the thinner side, which I'm realizing is probably my preferred matte formula. I like to slowly build my eyeshadows. I'm not so much a pack it on and blend out girly, and sometimes thicker powdery formulas do still blend out really well, but I think I do prefer a thinner formula just because I like to slowly build. I do think that the range of matte shades is pretty nice. I like the tones of the color selected, and I think if there was one thing that I could change about this palette, I would add one more deepening up shade because these 2 are the only 2 deep shades, and this one, I actually like that shade a lot because it's not a straight matte black. It's more of a charcoal, which to me is easier to work with and will blend into some of these other midtones a bit better than a matte black. That being said, a lot of these tones are similar depths, and I just feel like if there had been one more deepening up shade, that would have made this truly perfect to me. The shimmers are also really nice, no complaints there. They complement the color story really nicely. I really like the tone of this shade. It's super cool because it's got this like olivey green base with this beautiful purpley pink reflect over it. It's so pretty. And then this shade as well is super, super sparkly. It's got like a pretty mauvey pink base with like this gold to teal reflect on the top. It's so, so pretty. Something else I really like about the palette is that the shade names are not written on the front of this palette, which makes it super good for BYOPs, but the shade names are written on the bottom of the pans as well as on the back of the palette over here. So you have them here for reference if you ever need them. Next up is Simply Posh Cosmetics Coastal Palette, which was their summer release. This was another one that I purchased because the color story really called to me. It's another one that is both colorful yet slightly muted, but this time it's mostly warm tones, which I feel like is a bit more rare for like muted mattes. Usually we see them with cool tones. And aside from the mattes being a bit muted and desaturated, I feel like it really hits the mark when it comes to the theme, which is a coastal beachside theme. I feel like this is so, so perfect for that. Actually, this is my first full-size palette from the brand. I previously only had a few of their singles. They usually offer their shimmers as singles, but they also, way back, used to offer some of their mattes as singles. And so that's how I had tried out the formula before, which is what made me feel comfortable purchasing this palette. And the matte formula is just, it's super easy to work with. It's more on the buildable, blendable side, which I prefer. And with these tones, I feel like it's so easy to just slap them on and blend them out. It's very easy to work with. I actually have this shade in my crease as the transition shade. Let me get a little closer actually. I have that light olivey shade in my crease as a transition shade and also to blend out some of the darker mattes. And then the darker mattes are actually from the Blend Bunny Longing palette. One thing I want to note about Simply Posh is that I love how they do their palettes. Everything from the release schedule to the layout to the shimmer selection. And let me explain what I mean by that. Simply Posh has one of the slowest release schedules that I have seen in the indie world. They're always really well spaced out, which is so nice to see in kind of a fast-paced makeup release world. And then as far as the layout goes, I really like that they do usually a row of lighter mattes at the top and darker mattes at the bottom. I will say for this palette specifically, the bottom row doesn't go super, super deep, which I think works for a summertime palette when typically, and I'm not saying that you have to follow this, but typically people tend to go lighter with their eyeshadow looks. They go lighter with their base and they want to just like quickly get out the door because there are fun things to do in the summer, you know? So I can understand why the bottom row doesn't go super dark, but I do find myself reaching for extra deepening up shades with this palette. And then for the shimmers, something that I really like about Simply Posh is that their palettes are typically on the more affordable side, and that's because all of the shimmers that you see are usually duochromes, and so they don't have that expensive multi-chrome price tag, but they're still super special. And I can tell you that the shimmers in this palette are elevated from some of their previous ones because, like I said, I have some of the singles from their previous palettes, and these ones are just extra sparkly and twinkly and so beautiful. This shade over here is actually bonker sparkly. It is so wet looking and beautiful. And then this shade over here is also super special because though it's a duochrome, it's still super shifty and really twinkly and just so beautiful. Okay, for the second to last choice, I have Glaminatrix Barely Basic palette. Barely Basic is such a good name for this palette because it is anything but basic. It is a neutral leaning palette, but I think the tones that they chose for the mattes and how special the shimmers are take it to a new level. I love that each matte row has its own color story and you go from light to deep. I will say I think these two olivey shades are a little too similar, and I wish that this shade down here was a little darker, but aside from that, I feel like the matte selection is really solid. The formula on the Glaminatrix matte shades is super lovely, very easy to blend, and especially with these neutral leaning shades, it takes like 2 seconds to blend, no time at all. But I think where this palette really shines is the shimmers, because you have this top row of iridescents, which are they're all different colors and they're all super sparkly and complement the mattes really well. But then you also have the second row of shimmers, which this one and this one at the end are just regular metallics. There's no shifts or anything to them, but they're ultra foiled, super sparkly. You can build them up for a more foiled finish, or you can tap them on and sheer them out for a more twinkly effect. And then these two shades in the middle are also very, very sparkly. This one is actually a little dimensional. It has a few multicolored sparkles in it, and it's not, the sparkles aren't super distinct, but they do provide a dimensional finish to the eyeshadow. We're finally at my final choice for my top 10, which is the Clionadh Oceano palette. So this palette was launched in the summer along with the Paleo and Archeo palettes, and those two I think were revamps of palettes that they used to have back in the day sometime. I'm not exactly sure when, but then this palette, the Oceano palette, was a brand new palette, and it is such an interesting color story. It's actually a color story that I wasn't initially drawn to. It felt a little dissonant to me, but then the longer I looked at it, the more and more I saw little trios and quads of color combos that were so inspiring to me. I think the interesting choice of colors in this palette allowed me to think a little bit outside the box of what I normally do, because I feel like I do tend to gravitate towards more cohesive color stories, but then I tend to stick in my like safe zone and do color combos and techniques that I'm drawn to, and this palette pushes me out of my comfort zone a little bit. And of course, quality-wise, Clionadh always knocks it out of the park. These mattes were a brand new formula at the time of launch for Clionadh, and it is a bit more of a soft powdery formula, like super soft and super powdery. There is a lot of kick up in the pan with these mattes, and I don't mind that so much. I just make sure that I tap off my brush pretty well so that I don't get any fallout. But the mattes are very pigmented and incredibly easy to blend and work with. And then the shimmers are just chef's kiss. They're so good. I mean, would you really expect anything else from Clionadh? But I will say these two shimmers up here are two of my favorites in the palette, because they're kind of like, these are colors that you traditionally see as iridescence, but here in this palette, I feel like they have a bit of a base to them, and I really, really enjoy that. I feel like the slight base that they have to them makes the colors pop even more. And then I really quickly want to talk about these two shimmers down here, because both of them have a slightly dimensional quality to them, kind of like the dimensional and the dimensional light line from Clionadh, and I think that makes them super, super special. Okay, now that we have my more official choices out of the way, I want to talk about 3 collab palettes that I really enjoyed in 2024. First up is Ultraviolet, which is from Belle Beaute Bar, and it's a collab with Deandra Nicole on Instagram, and this is a perfect purple palette. Dee set out to make a perfect monochromatic purple palette that stays purple, that doesn't go pink, and has both warm and cool tone purples in it, and works for people of all skin tones. And that is exactly what this palette is. It's perfect. I love that it doesn't go pink on me. I love that I have a variety in both tone and depth while still being a monochromatic purple palette, and it's perfect. It's a perfect purple palette. This palette doesn't have the most multichromes in it because Dee is not a big multichrome person, but that's not to say that the shimmers aren't special. The shimmers are still really beautiful, and even like this shade that isn't like super sparkly or shifty, I love how glowy it is. Like that blue over the purple base it's perfect. And then this shade, Spiritual, is also so special and unique. It's got those multicolored sparkles, which you know I love, and yeah, I love everything in this palette. Next up is the Light Scatters palette, which is from Clionadh in collaboration with the one and only Bad to the Brow, aka Millie, and she made her perfect all shimmer palette. I think this was such a smart release, both for Clionadh and specifically from Millie, because we know that Millie loves shimmers. She's the OG multichrome queen, and she chose 9 really, really beautiful shimmers, and they're all stunning. They really, truly are all stunning. I actually have this one on my eyes right now. Let me bring you in a little closer. Here it is on my eyes. You can see how gorgeous it is. It's so fiery and shifty and stunning. The reason I think this is such a smart release is because I think it's a great way to try out a bunch of Clionadh shimmers, and the price point isn't really that bad. And I feel like the reason for that is because these pans are smaller than regular Clionadh pans, and so it allows you to have multiple shades for a lower price point. And so for that reason, I think it's good for newcomers to the brand who maybe don't want to order 9 individual singles and spend a lot. But at the same time, it's also good for people who have been purchasing from Clionadh, because we all have so much product at this point. Let's be real, most of us indie makeup lovers have so much eyeshadow that it's really nice to see smaller pans. And I mean, just look at some of these shades. They're so shifty, so sparkly, so magical. Millie really put her heart into this project, and it definitely shows. Lastly, I want to talk about Freya's collab with Cheeryep. This is the Floating Life palette. Actually, I'm not sure if it's Fleeting Life or Floating Life. I've seen both, but I've seen Floating Life more commonly, so that's what I'm going to call it in this video. This was another purchase palette, and I think this was my first flirtation with cool tones. I had been wanting to dip my toes into cool tones more, and when Freya came out with this, I knew that I had to support her. And I think at the time that I purchased this palette, I hadn't really used such cool tones, like gray cool tones, and I wasn't sure how much I would like them, but then the fact that this palette had that like dusty pink and purpley shades is what made me feel like, well, if I really don't like the gray tones, then at least I can make those work or even combine it with those and use the palette in that way. So this is not my first time trying a Cheeryep palette. My friend Vidya actually sent me one of their all shimmer palettes last year, and so that was my first time trying the brand. And if I'm being honest, that palette was not my favorite because the shimmers in that palette were a bit more on the overly emollient squishy side, and so they were just a little more finicky to work with. But I'm happy to report that the shimmers in this palette are not quite as emollient as the other palette, but they are still a little bit creamy. And so if you struggle with creasing, I don't know if these shimmers will work for you. And those are all my choices. I really didn't want this video to be too long, so I tried to keep my thoughts as concise as possible, but I feel like I could have talked at length about any of these palettes. Like even now, thinking about what I said, I feel like I missed a bunch of important information, but this isn't a palette review video. I'm just talking through my favorites and some of the reasons that I like them, and hopefully I can continue doing full palette overview videos as launches come out this year. And so when I do a wrap up of my favorite palettes at the end of 2025, you'll have all those videos to refer back to. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching if you made it till the end, and don't forget to comment what your favorite palettes of 2024 were, because I'm just nosy and I want to know. But please give this video a like and consider subscribing if you like makeup content. Bye!